Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Academy for Teachers Masterclass on Anti-Colonial Science with Dr. Max Liboiron. I'm Erin Coffey. My pronouns are she, her, and I've been teaching biology for the past 6 years at Trinity School. I love what I do because every year I get to not only help students explore their own questions about how the natural world works, I get to continually explore my own excitement for biology. And to challenge myself to learn more. Although I admit that I suspect many of you would have preferred maybe one or two fewer challenges over the past year, um, but that's neither here nor there. Since 2018, I've been a proud fellow of the Academy for Teachers, an organization that has helped me personally develop a more thoughtful, more inclusive pedagogy and given me the opportunity to learn from other experienced teachers and the way they've grappled with challenging topics, helping me open many students' eyes to the consequences of having a scientific institution that fails to question its biases. And so, especially in light of this learning, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Max Liboiron. Max is an associate professor of geography at Memorial University of Newfoundland. She directs the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research and has played leading roles in the establishment of the field of discard studies, the social study of waste and wasting, and the global open science hardware movement. Max is a figure in Indigenous science, technology studies, and justice-oriented science. Today, she will be leading us in identifying and questioning the colonial premises inherent to Western science, helping us explore together how science can be practiced in a manner that foregrounds good land relations, humility, and gratitude. Speaking as a white woman whose entire experience of both research science and science education took place within this colonial framework, I am really eager to dive in and develop tools to better recognize and to transfer power away from this mentality in my own classroom. So thank you in advance, Dr. Liboiron, for your energy and your work and for the time you're spending with us this week. But Dr. Liboiron is not the only star of this masterclass. It is also my honor to introduce the 23 teachers here today who were selected from many applicants. This is an impressive group with advanced degrees in education, biology, neuroscience, genetics, chemical biology, and chemistry. We teach grades K through 12 and early college in public schools, charter schools, and independent schools. Among this group, we've taught classes ranging from biology to environmental science, from research methods to the historical and scientific origins of race and gender. Our dedication to extracurricular service on behalf of our students is similarly impressive. We advise students for affinity groups, sustainability initiatives, and more. One of us even advises a remote gardening club. And honestly, I just wish I'd had the chance to be a student in some of your classes because they sound amazing. There's also a lot of teaching experience here today. We've been in the classroom between 3 and 25 years. The total number of years we've been teaching is more than 200. Each of us teaches between 50 and 480 kids. So the number of children who know our names collectively is 2,353, and that's this year alone. So your real audience today, Max, is those 2,353 kids, because every teacher here will in some way share with them what we learned from you. The ripple effect of a masterclass is huge. So thank you, Dr. Liboiron, for being here. Thanks to my fellow teachers for teaching. And with that, let the masterclass begin. Max, please take it away.
Thank you. So Tanshe, Max Liboiron Kashun, Laklibishtustien, Ikimitinishun. My name is Dr. Max Liboiron. Thank you for the introduction. I'm from Treaty 6 territory in what is lately called Canada. Grew up in a place called Lac La Biche, and I'm Métis of Métis Nation from Red River. My gender pronouns are they and she in that preferred order, but I'm not super picky. So yeah, so I am going to give a little bit of a context, especially in case you like whizzed through the readings, didn't do the readings or something like that. So we're all on the same page. And then we're going to do more of a workshop than a talking head situation. And I'll run us through that. So one of the reasons I was asked here is that I run CLEAR, Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research, which is an anti-colonial lab. We're also called a feminist lab. There are different ways we make ourselves legible. But basically, what it means is I'm fluent in both Indigenous and feminist and other critiques of dominant science across STEM, and the way it acts oppressively towards many forms of people, forms of knowledge, forms of life, not only Indigenous, but all sorts. Often without meaning to. right? It's that we are not here because of a legion of assholes, although, you know, colonialism does have legions of assholes. It's a more systemic problem, which makes it trickier. So what I do with CLEAR is I run the lab in a way that addresses these critiques and tries to do science differently, based in humility, based in accountability, based in good land relations. And that looks like a lot of different things. One of the things I want to mention is that I use the term anti-colonial science instead of decolonial science for two main reasons. The first is that everything in the kitchen sink is decolonial these days, right? Like it's become emptied of meaning. I saw a grant by like two German white ladies on like decolonizing, I forget what, the other day, and I was a little bit unsure of what was happening. But so it's become very trendy, and like a lot of trendy things, it's become a catch basin for funding and diverse forms of value and meaning. So I don't use it because I'm being a little more specific. The second is that I am from a tradition where decolonization specifically means the rematriation of land and Indigenous life. And decolonizing conferences and syllabi and your left foot does not generally repatriate land or address genocide, right? So Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have this awesome article called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." And in that, they actually talk about the education sort of context and how decolonization is very different than inclusion, than diversification, than equity, than anti-racism, and all those things are good, but they are different problems and have different approaches than decolonization and anti-colonialism, which is sort of what I'll talk about a little bit more. And by conflating those things, you end up, they called enclosing it, so domesticating it, taking the teeth out of it, when basically colonization means all the bad stuff and decolonization means all the good stuff. It means that you start misaligning the good stuff for the bad stuff, and a lot of the bad stuff doesn't get addressed, right? So that's why I gave you one of the readings, the colonialism, or the primer on colonialism, so that when I say we're doing anti-colonial work for the next 45 minutes or whatever, we know exactly what I'm talking about. We're talking about addressing non-Indigenous access to Indigenous land, which includes life and ideas and worlds for non-colonial goals, including benevolent ones. And that's the only problem we're going to work on. Because if you also want to work on racism and lack of inclusion and epistemicide, which is the death of forms of knowledge, like it's just, it gets, you're not going to address them all, right? They're different sort of things. So that's what we're going to deal with today. The other thing is that that's really important, I think, to understand, and Tuck and Yang talk about this a bit, is that if you deal with something like inclusion, that you might be also doing colonialism. So this is like an example that happens all the time, where people, and this happens to me all the time, people are like, oh, we need to bring more Indigenous folks into STEM. And so they try and gather up these Indigenous youth and bring them into a STEM context that is like really brutal for Indigenous folks in an attempt to like, it's called diversifying empire, right? So making better colonial subjects. So a lot of different science programs around here are about civilizing essentially Indigenous folks using, you know, code or the scientific method, or having them sort of learn properly. And that's been a hallmark of colonialism for a long time, right? The civilization of Indigenous folks in non-Indigenous terms, using education, right? That's what the residential schools were, where Indigenous folks, kids were taken from their families to, quote unquote, kill the Indian, save the man, right? Separate them from all relations, including knowledge. So that's why it's really important to separate them out, which is what we're going to do today. So the second reading that I put on the table was to show that this colonialism, right, this non-Indigenous entitlement to Indigenous land, worlds, lives, happens without intent, happens without colonial intent, happens by people with the best intentions, right? But it still has colonial effect. So there's always a gap between intent and effect. And a big part of accountability is recognizing that and apologizing when there's a really big gap and trying to work towards it, right? So something is as normal as standardization, right, is what the Orion article talked about. And there's another way it, standardization has colonial effect that I don't talk about in that article, which I talk about in my book, which is coming out in April, which is that the standardization of methods and scientific equations and that sort of stuff let non-Indigenous folks, gives them access to land, Indigenous land, without ever setting foot on it. So you can regulate a river as a government. Scientists can know about the river if someone sends them the velocity and temperature and whatever. You can do the oxygen sag, and that gives you access to land without ever having to go there. Right, so that article is meant to show that, like, I mean, you can look for assholes acting in a colonial way and you will find them and you can address those, and that's fine. But there's also just a myriad of ways in everything you do in science, from like ordering supplies for your lab, to figuring out what readings you're doing, to figuring out which measurements you're using and not using, what your research questions are. Every moment you can interrogate for colonial relationships. And that makes the work of anti-colonialism easier because you can do it in literally any moment, right? So that's the good news. Yes, so one of the things I want to mention before we get started in the workshop discussion part is that I don't have any expectation whatsoever that someone's going to come out of this with a complete understanding of what anti-colonial science is and how it works. I don't have that. And I'm one of the foremost whatever's in the field, right? Not including elders who don't use the terms anti-colonial science. What I am hoping for is to lead you with an approach so that you can do this work and carry out this work sort of with a very basic tool, not complete understanding. So basically, the approach is going to be, number one, identify colonialism in the everyday. And number two, say, okay, how can it not be like that? And that's basically it. It's not so easy. And we'll go around and talk about that. But that's it. That's what anti-colonial science essentially is. Oops, that's colonial. I have noticed it. What else could we do instead? All right, so we are going to do a conversation now, and based on that conversation, it'll sort of dictate what we do after that. So there are a couple of guidelines for this conversation. Let me find my fanciness here. There's my fanciness. So here are our rules, or our guidelines, I should say, for the conversation that is about to take place among us. Number one diva, one mic. That means one person speaks at a time. Luckily on Zoom, that's very achievable. But it's a form of respect. It's about listening, right? Number two, your story, your choice. That means whatever you offer in the group, you should do because you want to, not because you feel obliged or pressured to. This is especially important for BIPOC folks, folks with disabilities, immigrants, whatever, because you are not our curriculum, right? So only offer things that you want to share and hold back what isn't for sharing. That's important. Don't yuck my yum. If someone puts something on the table, your job is to yes and it, not it, right? These are all offers. This includes if someone puts something on the table that's harmful, rather than calling them out, call them in, right? Instead of ostracizing them, bring them into community and talk about the gap between intent and effect, right? There are survivors here. That means don't speak in a cavalier or flippant fashion about colonialism or genocide or rape or racism or ableism or all of these things, because there are people in this room who are survivors of that, and it's our job to respect the burdens they're carrying by not dumping a load on their head. Of course, we're going to talk about those things, but you talk about them as if you're talking to survivors, because you are. And then last but not least, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So that's a really key part of safer spaces. So if you want to take someone else's story or whatever out of this group, you need to ask them first. Otherwise, whatever happens in this room stays in this room. And of course, you're meeting tomorrow, right? Same group, same room with a gap. But yeah, any questions, comments about the guidelines for collaborative discussion?
Well, I think I just have one point to make, is that in relation to what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, this is being recorded.
So
And
you
it's
have
going
to
be
ask
part
for,
of a video library. So
yeah, so you have to have asked for consent for that. And I would say at the end that if anyone wants their parts taken out, you should ask for that too.
okay.
Yeah. Thanks for the note. I forgot about that. Although there's a giant sign at the top that says that it's being recorded. So with caveats. All right, so we're going to do what's called a round robin. It's got a lot of names, but basically we're just going to go one at a time, and I'll pose a question or a prompt, and we'll go one at a time until we start reaching saturation, which means people start to say the same things over and over again, and then we'll have a discussion and then a new prompt, and we'll go along. That means that we will probably get to everyone in the next little while, but not everyone will answer talk for each prompt. I need to get rid of this thing. Okay. All right. So, oh, and in the round robin, you can always just say pass, right? If I call on you and it's your turn, and you don't want to speak for whatever reason, just say pass, and we'll pop over you, and we'll come back to you in the next round, and that's fine. And you can pass the whole time. I once had a student 3 times a week, a class, he passed every single time. And at the end of the semester, he says, I've never spoken so much in a class. I was like, awesome. 3 passes a week. That's a lot of discussion for him. So, and I'll say the person who comes after them, so you have a bit of a moment. It's very normal to pass if you're cold called. That's totally fine. So what I want us to start with is, what have you noticed in your own context as teachers, as researchers, as whatever relationship you have to research that is colonial? Meaning, what are these moments that you can identify where you've noticed that there's something that happens that embodies non-Indigenous access to Indigenous land, which is everywhere in North America, for non-Indigenous goals, including benevolent ones? We'll do Andrew and then Ruth.
The first thing that occurred to me was the claims to like save the rainforest. Also my daughter has been really into stopping palm oil. She's only 8. But understanding that like the people who live there are, trying to make a living, trying to get by, and here from where we are, we're trying to influence how they access their land in what we think to be a benevolent way. But it is, I think it's connected.
Yeah, a lot of environmentalism is actually quite colonial in various ways. Yeah, which doesn't mean they have to be, but yeah. Thank you. Ruth and then David.
First thing that comes to mind for me is I've been thinking about this idea of land, and I guess just the way that the idea that things are connected to land is denied, or it doesn't exist. It's almost like land doesn't really exist in the way that most things are talked about. And I think that like that very denial that like land we're living on land seems to me to be colonial, ironically, because it's like the land doesn't exist in this framework, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Can you give an example of when that would happen? It's really hard to change things if you don't have somewhere to start from.
So, just for example, where things come from, the idea that everything comes from somewhere sometimes it seems like that's like a radical idea. And the idea that, I think maybe even living in a city also, like we're in denial of like land that's under our feet. Like if you talk to people about land, I think that sometimes people will say, oh, I don't really get, I'm not really connected to the land, even though the land is here. So, and then on the other side of it, so maybe there's I'm thinking about like a spectrum of time. So there's like where everything comes from doesn't exist, where we are now doesn't exist, and where everything goes after we're done with it doesn't exist. None of those things exist. It's like, I feel like there's, in the ways that people normally talk, there's just denial of those three things.
Okay.
I don't know if that was specific enough.
It was a little less specific than I was going for, but you set some terms, so that's good enough. That's where we are. Thank you. David and then Rachel.
I was thinking about, the location of my school. So not necessarily, going out into the big wide world of, and, hearing about research there, but just where our school is located.
Yeah, so there's a specific example of potentially what Ruth was talking about, right? Like, so let's go find a research site. Let's go find land. Well, there's the water fountain outside of room 202, right? There's the bathroom, there's the front porch, there's the window there. Yeah. There's the ancestral land. Yeah. Thank you. Rachel and then Fletcher.
So when you posed the question, the first thing I was thinking of is, say, doing academic research, and who obviously who's writing the research that you're reading and giving you access to these histories. Like, I think often if you're looking something up online and in a format, say like JSTOR or any like academic database, you don't really know anything about the author, and so like there's kind of just like this objective, like this is the person who's the authority on this, so, and they're in this database, so we must use this as a resource.
Excellent, yes. Fletcher and then Renee.
I would struggle to be usefully specific as well. However, the characteristic that dominates a lot of complexity in my practice more than anything else is the socioeconomic status of my students, and it is very complex to parse the relationship between socioeconomic status and colonialism, because they're not the same, but there is a lot of interconnectivity there.
Yeah, it's like race and class as well.
Yes.
Gender and all sorts of intersectional niggly wigglies. Yeah, definitely. Renee and then Madeline. We're all watching you.
Sorry about that. Yes,
right.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. I was thinking about what I was going to say. So what I was thinking about as a non-scientist and as somebody who was trained as a historian was the development of industrial farming methods. And the creation of norms that occur regardless of place. The development of hybrid seeds that are sent across the world, the development of chemical fertilizers that are sent across the world, regardless of a specific space or set of traditions, or even diets and foodways.
Okay, Madeline, before you go, I'm gonna shift the question. I'm sure you had something awesome prepared and now you're totally unprepared. So what is something that happens in your classroom within your jurisdiction, right? Something that you have control over that you're like, oh, that might be colonial. Madeline and then Vanessa.
So I mean, I can kind of relate this to something similar I was going to respond with for the first question, where just something that happened recently in regards to a unit on like renewable resources and listing out pros and cons and ending a session and realizing we only talked about like things involved with like economic pros and cons and expenses and not actually the impact of like hydroelectric dams or wind farms on like indigenous land and spaces and organisms. And I had control over that, and I sort of let it get away as the sake of like making sure we cover those topics without actually doing like justice for my kids and going over these other impacts.
Awesome. Yeah, so one of the #1 problems we have in this province environmentally is the Muskrat Falls Dam, which provides hydroelectricity and also methyl mercury to Inuit food webs. And I don't think there's a single person in this province who's for it, including the environmentalists, right? Because it's a huge contamination of Indigenous food webs. So that's a great example, for which there are many counterexamples. So Vanessa and then Katrina, what's going on in your classrooms that might be colonial?
Hi. I teach very young students, so it's been like reading your article and thinking about standardization has been like eye-opening, really, because I try to orient the kids to thinking about, you know, standardized ways of measuring, standardized ways of, you know, language, and so I try to be creative in the way that they're able to communicate, you know, their findings. But even that, right? I mean, I'm just beginning to think like, how do I get through this, and how do I truly, you know, break the cycle? You know, so it's just the trouble of like, you know, dealing with very young children and you know, the language of science that they always talk about. So, that's where I am, and thank you. This article is really eye-opening in terms of like standardization and colonialism.
Well, in terms of like maths and counting and standard measurement, there are two really great resources and sources out there who've done a lot of the heavy lifting. One is Rochelle Guerrera, who's at one of the Illinois universities, and she did Living Mathematica is what is the name of the piece, and it's all about learning maths and stuff through pattern, like observing patterns in the world and putting the joy back in math, especially for Latinx and Indigenous kids that might have had it like not had a good relationship with it through various ways. And the other, and this is not about education, it's about a white woman who went to Africa to teach children how to count right. It's called Science and an African Logic by Helen Varane. And over the course of her teaching, she was like, holy crap, I think I'm an asshole. And it's during this moment of counting, trying to teach these very young kids how to group, like, so like just before addition, right? Like how to group things ready for addition, that she's like, oh, I'm doing something horribly wrong. And the book is her journey through realizing that and then trying to correct that. So anyway, there's folks who you know, have a path ahead of that and have written about it. Katrina and then Tracy.
Okay, so something that came to mind for me is map making, and that's something central to the kids at my school. So it's a social studies based school, and most of my projects include making an elevation map, a terrain map, you name it. And when I first came to the school, it was like I was faced with like a dilemma. Do I use the maps that they have that have the same like continents in the middle all the time? And when the kids ask, why do all the maps look like this? I was like, well, do I trash them? But no, I'm also like the sustainability person. Like I have to use them for something. So we kind of like tore apart the maps and like rebuilt our own. And then like the idea of like different map projections, actually naturally folded. That was a terrible pun. And we went into what different map projections can do and what like the political ramifications are. And we got a little bit of pushback from a very small amount of parents. And we're a very progressive school, so that was like actually unusual for us. And I should also say, like, we're at liberty to, like, I make my own curriculum, so I'm able to do that. But it was really like remarkable to watch the kids make their own maps and look at different projections and what this visual is telling people about a place just from size or orientation and what it could do politically and what like harm that could cause.
And of course, cartography has a huge place in colonialism and making places accessible for colonial forces to settle and all the rest of it. Yeah, I have a great grandfather who was a surveyor who worked closely with cartographers for the Hudson Bay Company, and we don't talk about him in the family. There is a great book called The Power of Maps, if you don't know it, that is not explicitly anti-colonial, but it talks about a range of politics that colonialism is very much part of. And I think it might have a workbook that goes with it. And it's an introductory late high school, early college, I think, text, but it can be parsed by teachers. Tracy and then Annie.
So this happened today. So I've kind of tried to spend the year, well, I said I was going to spend the year moving away from kind of these ideas of standardization and also this emphasis on individuals and celebrating the successes of individuals doing science. And yet today in my cell biology class, I was talking about this Nobel laureate and the research this Nobel laureate did. And I promised myself I wasn't going to do that this year. And I realized I'm falling back on these easy ways of celebrating science being done by individuals and easily ignoring the contributions of all the other people to their research and all the shoulders that they're standing on. And this is going to be really hard to fix.
I just finished a blog post that has not gone through editor approval yet for Discard Studies called Firsting in Research. And it's this idea that every time someone says, this is the first person to, they are necessarily erasing all local knowledge. And there's this really great paper, and Renee is collecting them all. If you want tomorrow, because it's like nighttime here. So when it is morning time and my work time again, I'll put together a bibliography and send it in so that you can circulate it to your next meeting. Assuming I remember everything, I'll take a screenshot at the end. Anyway, this concept of firsting, and there's a great piece by Anderson and Christian called Decolonizing Attribution. They're librarians, and they talk about like this colonial propertying, like when someone says I am the first to, they liken it to a property claim, intellectual property, right? It is a property claim, and how that disenfranchised, contributes to the erasure of Indigenous folks who have clearly known it before. And even if it is like a super specific scientific thing that isn't part of other knowledge systems, it's still making the exact same moves. Thank you, Renee, for the running bibliography. But yes, that's a great identification. Annie, and then Nicholas, and Nicholas, you'll be our last for this prompt.
So I teach a class called Science Research, and for that we go to a nearby park, Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, and we collect insects and vertebrates, and then we sequence their DNA to look at biodiversity in New York City, which, talking about benevolent aims, but that land that we collect from is an originally Indigenous land. And I was actually even thinking about how the students write about the land, and they write about it as Van Cortlandt Park, owned by the Van Cortlandt family. And so, yes, benevolent purpose, non-Indigenous land, non-Indigenous purpose.
And our kin, those bugs are our kin, right? So assuming just you get entitlement to their bodies and their lives for your teaching project, right? So people have pointed that out in this exercise in the past with plant identification. This one student was like, you just take the leaves, like right off the tree, and it's yours now, and you take it back. And she, like, when this first happened, she was like, holy shit, you just do that to the tree? Doesn't the tree need that leaf? Kind of like, so same sort of thing. Going back to what David was saying, you could sequence the dead flies in the that are already dead in the windowsills of any location in the Bronx and probably get a certain type of, also easier to sequence. But yeah, definitely there's layers there. Yeah, excellent. Nicholas.
Hi. So I had a couple things. One of them was similar to what Tracy was saying, actually, is I give a lot of readings of current research, and I certainly, for my high school kids, do not do enough vetting of who it is that has done the research. And that's something that I sort of never even really thought about till I read materials you sent over for this. And the other thing is, one of the topics that comes up both in my, with my littler kids and in my high school class, we talk obviously a lot about classification systems. And that is an area where, again, I not really until this year thought about where it came from and needing to address why it's problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that our lab does is I research plastic pollution, and there is a standard set of categories for plastics, and we don't use them because there are certain categories of plastic that mean much more here that are not in the standardized lexicon. And the most pressing example of that is threads, which I mentioned in passing in the Orion piece, with things that come out of fishing gear. And we do not use the category of user plastics, which I do not talk about in Orion, because it makes it seem as if users produced the plastics when it's really oil, natural gas, and other sort of regimes that make the plastics, especially in places where there's only one store and there's no such thing as consumer choice, which describes the vast majority of this province. Right, so there's so much baked into that, into categorization. So how much time do I have left? This half hour is really throwing me off, as it does. Master timekeeper,
So,
Renee?
Yeah, so you've got about a half an hour.
Okay, half an hour from how will bring me to, okay. Thank you. It's our sovereign half hour. It's the island of Newfoundland saying, we are not actually part of Canada, and we will prove it to you by this random time zone. It's a legacy of Canada being the last choice for Newfoundland and Labrador to join after 3 other choices that rejected us because we're so poor. A little bit of Newfoundland Labrador history for you. So, okay, we're going to start with Felisa now, and then Lutz. So you can take your own example or any of the examples that have been provided here. All of these are about colonialism. They're about colonial land relations. They're about entitlement and access as a very latent premise that we're making explicit. So what could you do differently that would be anti-colonial? Not necessarily inclusive, not necessarily Indigenous, not just not that, just not colonial in either these examples or one you already had in your head when we were doing the last round. Felicia. You are muted.
Always happens. Yeah, when you said earlier that this is not about inclusion, this is, not about race, there's so many things to unpack. It was just like, it just threw me off because for the past months, in our school, we've been focusing on anti-racism. So now thinking like shifting that to anti-colonialism is just kind of like, okay, what can I bring in, or how do I address that in a different way? So it's just thinking about what Tracy and Nicholas have mentioned about just highlighting scientists' work. Because that was my goal this semester, is to try to, in a way, shift my curriculum into just like, okay, we cover this in chemistry, but then let's look at the people behind this research. So I think going to your questions, like what I could have done differently, right? Is that what you're asking?
Or what can you do differently? Yeah.
I think it's...
We're not going to blame you for anything that happened before this workshop. It's not what could have you done, it's what will you do next time.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of work to do. I have to shift that mindset for me. Like I have to refocus my goals in a way, right? Like you gave me like the vocabulary words that you mentioned in the beginning. I think it's something that I don't know yet how I would do it differently, but I think for me it's more of educating myself more on, and then just kind of like refocusing my goals. So what are my goals? What do I have? I think in more of like reflection, that's what I would do. And then in a framework of anti-colonialism, and also if I'm hearing this for the first time, processing it for the first time, I think like it would be harder also for my students who are wired to, or trained also by us teachers who are in this work to do that. So I think for me, it's just gathering materials and just educating myself more about this work.
Yeah, so that's an excellent response, being like, I don't know how yet, and here is why, and here are the terms, and here's, you know, my commitment. So good on you that anti-racism and so racialization and indigenization are two very different things. There is some overlap because a lot of Indigenous folks are racialized, but I'm what's called a white Métis. I get all the privileges of whiteness and all the shittinesses of anti-indigeneity in one package. That gives me immense privilege in some places, but I'm still equally likely to be missing and murdered as other women, regardless of whether that are Indigenous, regardless of whether they pass for white. So, and also there's this huge problem that we're facing in Canada and the United States in particular, where lots of white folks claim indigeneity through their great-great-great-great-great-grandmother Cherokee princess in a way that they don't really vie for racialization, although I mean, you have your Rachel D's, right? There are examples, but indigenization is not the same as racialization. That's why so many people appropriate indigeneity to sort of, right? So understanding that actually they're two different things, and the sort of movements to deal with anti-racism will not necessarily, I mean, they might leak on to other anti-colonialism, and that's great, but they are not synonymous is really, really important. So Felicia, it's really hard to ask yourself, how can I do this in an anti-colonial way? The easier question, which is the same question, is what are the land relations here? How do I make them better? Right? Land relations that are characterized by resource relations, unidirectional or non-reciprocal relations, extractive relations, entitlement, any of those sorts of land relations. As colonial. And you do not have to be Indigenous to feel the negative effects of colonial instruments and colonial worldviews, right? Yeah, so that's the easy, when you're trying to be like, okay, how do I be responsible to this? The easier sort of route to put yourself on is, okay, what are the land relations and how do I make them better? As opposed to like, what is colonial about this and how do I be anti-colonial, which is a way like more heady and abstract thing, but they're the same question. They're the same framework. Lutz, and then Nikita.
What came to mind to me is that the students don't really understand what colonialism is. And one of the first steps I think might be important is to frame that, like define colonialism and acknowledge that we live on colonial land in the United States, and then continue to talk about the indigenous land that we live on and name the land and give, you know, credit to the people who really were here first. And yeah, so that's one thing I was thinking about.
You guys are all New York City, right? Is that true? Yeah.
Brooklyn.
So that's Lenape land. Yeah, and you mirrored that there are no Lenape anymore. That's not true. The Lenape were marched out of the New York City state, and they are now all the way up into Ontario in Canada. In New Jersey, there's a bunch of Lenape folks and chiefs and nations where they intersected with plantation slavery. New Jersey is a hot mess of like Indigenous and racist and slavery sort of nuggets. So is New York, but so yeah, so there's actually like Lenape folks around who speak Lenape, and you know, a very intact and in many cases thriving culture. So in the event you hear that there are no Lenape, it's called the Trail of Blood, because they were force marched and a lot of folks died. So yeah, FYI, when you're doing that lesson, might want to lighten it up a bit, maybe not, but that's what's going on with the Lenape. Nikita, and then Katherine.
So I have a lot of thoughts. I feel like a big thought that came up for me throughout this entire Raben was just I'm trained in geology. Like I got my degree in geosciences, and I just like have all these memories of going on field trips with professors, and like there was no land acknowledgement, first of all. And then there was also just this like entitlement to the rocks, like, and all the outcrops, and like, yeah, we're gonna like just, it'll be like, do not enter. And the professor will be like, LOL, and just like enter. And it would just, it's just this, I had never really thought about it before. It was just part of the experience of geology for me, that you just like go look for the science, you like go look at the land, and like there's no acknowledgement of the history of that land or who that land originally belonged to. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about the samples of rocks in my classroom that I have not acknowledged, where those rocks came from, how I got those rocks. Some of them I bought, but most of them I found, and like found them on field trips. And like when I talk about the history of New York State in my earth science class, like we talk about the geological history, but we don't ever acknowledge that like the original folks on that land and the indigenous people of that land. And so I'm thinking about ways in which I can get students to kind of engage in that moving forward.
So one of the things that we do with samples in my lab is we rematriate them back to the land. And that's something we do. I mean, I worked with animal guts and like water samples and stuff like that. And as long as we don't find contamination that would hurt land and relatives, we put them back. And we usually put them back in ceremony. But everyone, including non-Indigenous folks, can contribute to that sort of situation because they can understand like ecological relations or like ecological responsibility or accountability or all these sorts of things. The other thing that reminded me of is my godfather, who's Kumié, which means he's from sort of the part of the United States that's in sort of California and a bit south. That's Kumié land, all the way down to the border. So you might have heard about the skirmishes with Kumié trying to protect their land from the Trump wall. But he sent me a rock the other day from his homelands. And he was like, I'm sending you one of our relatives. And I was like, dude, stop it. I have to care for this now. And I've already got 2 dogs and 2 kids and all these house plants. And now I have to look after this bloody rock. And I just don't want that kind of responsibility. So I'm going to send that relative home because I mean, first of all, it's his homelands and he has some autonomy and he's an elder and all this sort of stuff. But also you end up with all of these responsibilities of care if you think of those as somebody's relative, even if they're not your relative, right? And like a lot of Indigenous folks have something in cosmology like grandfather rocks or something like that. And so you have to treat them like grandfathers, and that's a shit ton of work because like respecting grandfathers is a lot of work. So there's a lot of different ways to relate to rocks in an anti-colonial way. There's like a spectrum. There's a whole bunch of different things. So yeah, it's a good example. Yeah. Think of them as like aunties. What would you do for a room full of aunties? Oh shit, you gotta feed them now. Well, what do rocks eat? Oh my god, there's ways to go on that. For anyone who has samples. Katherine and then Emily.
So one thing that I was thinking about, especially after reading your article, was about standardization and how much I like glorify it, especially at the age group that I teach. So I can think about, a lab I assigned today where they have to take their own pulse and they have to design their last experimental group. And they know they're going to be assessed on, like, did you keep certain things standardized? And so it's like on a podium, literally, like their grade, right? And so to make space equally for when that's damaging. And I'm thinking about this all in the context of another lab that I was going to give as my example that we do earlier in the year, which is a tree measuring lab. So the students go out and they find a tree and they take a string around it, take that and then calculate how much carbon is stored in the tree. So that's use of land for non-Indigenous purposes. And so I'm sitting here thinking like, how could I put these two things together to like interrupt the colonialism in that tree lab? And I'm not gonna lie, I'm struggling. Like one idea I have is potentially in the lab, I really simplified it. Trees have all different kinds of bumps and then you change the calculation for that. You do this. And for my freshman, I said, just find a tree that looks like this. Just find, instead of making space for the fact that you do have to alter the calculation for the trees that look different. And maybe that could be a way to interrupt colonialism in that lab, but I'm also not confident that that's far enough. So if anybody is having a better idea than me, I'm really open to hearing that. Those are some of the thoughts I'm having.
Yeah, by the way, if you are in New York City and you do want to have permission to go onto Lenape land, the American Indian Community House has resources and like they do it for their events and stuff because the American Indian Community House isn't full of Lenape people and the last 3 directors haven't been to Lenape. So they have to ask permission all the time. Just don't, if a zillion of you show up, just don't tell them that I sent you. The former director is my godfather. But he helps people with that all the time, get permission, which is sometimes denied, of course, and often comes, like sort of someone comes into your house, you invite them, but they have to take off their shoes, right? I mean, there's terms that come with those invitations. So FYI, if you, yeah, and just that sort of entitlement, right? You're invited. That takes care of it. Emily, and then Erin.
I've been thinking about my use of Carolina Biological to buy supplies, living specimens, preserved specimens, fossils, etc., and not asking the question of how they were obtained and where they came from. So that's something that I'm going to have to examine and sit with and work around, I think.
Yep, that's a good example. Erin, and then Katie with a C.
So, and maybe this is a little abstract and not concrete, but one of the ways that I've been trying to change my teaching this year is to make ethics a critical component of the conversation and to kind of, so we started the year this year and I just loved the places that it ended up taking students and the way that they were engaging with these ideas. We started with a week and a half on bioethics and on the ethics of care and about the importance of considering the importance of not taking science as impartial and as like this objective force that only produces neutral data, which is so much how they think of it, and trying to get them to think a lot more about who's affected, why do these people have the perspectives that they do, what is informing the values, how is that playing out in their morals and then in their relationships with people around, with the animals and other humans and the land. And so my students got a chance to do stakeholder analysis and think about who is thinking what and why, and explicitly making clear for themselves like what perspectives they were valuing and what they were not valuing when they were making decisions based on science and ethics. And that was, for some of my students, it was really uncomfortable and they didn't, but it was, for some of my students, it was just this really eye-opening, like, oh my gosh, there's like, here are the things that I am valuing and I didn't realize. And so it's something I'm trying to do throughout the year whenever I can. Some units I'm having more trouble figuring out how to do it than others that are like the molecular ones, although I'm super appreciative of the Carolina biological comment. So that's one thing I've been trying.
Cool, thank you. Katie and then Sophia.
I teach a health and science class mixed together, and we spend a whole semester learning about substance use. And one part of the class is the ancient and indigenous context for substance use and like relationships to plants and that context. And so something that I can do, or I'm trying to do more of, is bring in experts. So have students talk to people who have actual knowledge, like field knowledge on this. And yeah, it's a science class, but we also spend a lot of time balancing historical perspectives and how that got us to where we are with how this country legalizes or criminalizes substance use and how that's changed. So considering those contexts is a step towards anti-colonialism in my classroom.
So what are the land relations in that? I'm asking you a super tricky question.
I think part of it is depending on where you are, you have access to different forms of life that grow out of the land. And so that is one aspect of it. It's different today because a lot of people don't grow their own substances. Like some people grow weed, but it's not like, I don't think people are growing peyote in New York. I mean, maybe, who knows? I know people who grow mushrooms, but I'm saying too much now.
Don't check my friends list. What was I going to say? So you didn't say this, but it makes me think of something. So one of the scepters of colonialism in inclusion. So you're talking about potentially an inclusion regime where, okay, there's Western science, but there's also indigenous sciences and ways of knowings and doings and being with these plants. I want to tell them both. And you didn't talk about this, and I don't think this is necessarily an issue, but one of the things I want to flag is bringing in the indigenous to be anti-colonial can often be access to indigenous worlds for non-indigenous goals, enrichment. Right. And so I hope, Katie, when you bring folks in, you pay them like experts, or if you bring in like whatever the terms you bring in for non-indigenous experts, you also do for those experts. So one of the things that happens a lot is people will ask for indigenous guest speakers or elder guest speakers, but they will not pay them or treat them the same way they bring in other guest speakers. So that's just something that I flagged because it's going to be, and it's going to be a thing that a lot of folks reach for because it's like pretty available as a practice. And thank you for the opportunity for me to talk about that, Katie. Sophia.
Hello, everyone. So I teach ecology and earth science in upstate New York, and I definitely can echo what Nikita mentioned about having rock samples. And all of my rock samples I collected on stolen land and honestly stole myself. So the first thing, like one of the first steps that I can take is acknowledging that with the students. And that when I went on this hike, I was on land that originally belonged to, or belonged is the wrong word, but was originally cared for by this group of people. They've been chased out. Then later I got to go in and I took these samples without anybody's permission, and they're here for you today. And honestly, Max, what you mentioned about grandfather rocks and treating them with respect, that's something that I want to bring in when I get to my rock unit, because I always say respect my rocks. But now this is more of a like a social emotional way to explain why they need to be respected, is giving them even higher of a status. And so some of the ways that I'm decolonizing my education now, so with my ecology curriculum, I don't have a set state curriculum. I can do whatever I want. And in upstate New York, I live in Kingston, New York, we have a very high amount of new students coming in from Guatemala, and a lot of them are from indigenous areas and they are catie. So I've changed a lot of what I do in ecology to more cater to them. And instead of teaching like mostly white dominated science, I now look for and try to honor Native people stories, especially if they are from the Yucatan Peninsula area, because that's where my students are from. And then in my earth science curriculum, I always try to do at least one cultural activity with students. So for example, when it was the winter solstice, I played a video of an elder who was explaining what the significance of the winter solstice was to his peoples, what the legend was, what the long night is. And so then I went into the curriculum for earth science and talking about the rotation and our orbit around the sun and those different things. But I'm finding, you know, in every unit, a place to give Indigenous cultures a voice. And then, you know, reading the wee primer on colonialism, I had to think a little bit, because the part that was mentioned of you have Indigenous science, and then you have, you know, like white people can't do Indigenous science. And so now I kind of have to think, you know, like, am I appropriating these stories, or am I giving these stories the spotlight that they deserve with their own voices?
So the Aorta Collective has an awesome resource about appropriation. It's like a checklist of things to ask yourself to figure out if you're doing appropriation or not. I highly recommend it. It's excellent and very grounding.
Is it AERTA?
No, it's an acronym. AORTA, Aorta, all caps collective. They're an anti-oppressive co-op. They do all sorts of stuff, but there we go. There we go. Thank you, Rachel. The thing, and this goes back to what Felicia said, being like, okay, I want to do a form of good. Oh shit, is this inclusion? You didn't say shit, but for cinema, we will say that. I thought this might be inclusion. Oh, this might be diversification. Oh, damn, am I doing appropriation? What are the land relations? Are you changing land relations? If you're not changing land relations, you might be doing inclusion, or you might be, you know, not inherently bad, but also not anti-colonial. Right. So this whole, like, okay, what are the good sought and the bads fought, and how do I make sure they match each other, is tricky. It's a sign of, like, getting into the nuance of those is like the hallmark of long-term activists and elders and stuff like this. Yeah, I think that's what we'll do there. So, okay, we have a little bit of time left. We might be able to get through everyone again. The Aorta Collective, by the way, also has a really good anti-oppressive facilitation guide that's really good for structuring classrooms and discussions. And they are part of where these come from, these guidelines, One Diva, One Mic. Don't yuck my yum. Some of them come from their trainings, their anti-oppressive facilitations. And they do classes. So yeah, let's do a form of checkout where we do a round robin again, and you just say with what you're sitting with. So not what you've resolved, but what you haven't resolved, right? So what trouble are you going to stay with? What's the like, yeah, what are you turning over and sitting with? What trouble are you going to stay with that is not resolved, but is, like, still very much on the table for you? We might be in the same order as before, so long as you guys didn't pop in and out of my screen. So that's Andrew and then Ruth.
I think I'm still processing anti-colonial.
Yep. The main concept, legit. Yeah, it's like, sort of like Felicia pointed out, like, which one is it? which good / bad is this? Very legit. Yeah. Ruth and then David.
I think I'm just thinking, seems like my takeaway is that it's very specific, and you know, before you were asking me to be more specific, and now I'm thinking, oh yeah, the reason is because there's no generalization here. Each thing is specific. So my specific thing that I'm going to think about next is is vaccination, because I'm thinking about vaccination for my class coming up. We're talking about it, and the history of inoculation, really, I guess maybe I should say, because even the word vaccination is yeah, just a lot going on with it. So yeah, that's it. Inoculation.
So the thing about specificity is that so there's this thing that people say about Indigenous folks, like the all our relations. Oh, Indigenous, it's all our relations. We're all related. Yes, that's a very common part of many, though not all, Indigenous cosmologies. But the thing is about all our relations is that they're actually really specific and uneven. So you sort of know this because you were related to both your daughter and your third cousin 3 times removed, but your obligations to them are quite different. And so specificity is super important if you're going to carry out those obligations. And so you can think of it in that spirit. Like the reason that we're specific is that what you do with anti-racism is going to be very different than what you do with anti-colonialism, because one is your cousin and one is your daughter. And one is your older daughter and one is your younger daughter. Different again, right? So specificity is really important to this. So good noting. And there are certain things that people say all the time, like honoring and respect and reciprocity. And I'm like, what do you mean? People almost never know. There are ways to gloss and not name the relation in a certain way. Even Indigenous folks, I'm like, what the fuck do you mean honoring? You're going to honor your, what do you mean? And they're like, oh, not be a jerk. I'm like, that seems insufficient. And that helps get to the what are your goods and what are your bads when you can get more specific about those things. So thank you for that. David, and then Rachel.
I feel like I have a lot to think about. I think one thing I'm still grappling with is when an idea like certain standardizations and classifications, where I still do see merit in that, and how to kind of reconcile that with where that's coming from and how to present that to students.
Yeah, so I've got a section in my book, which you can't get until April, about the difference between colonial sciences and Western sciences. Because there's some overlap, because they like got born together, but they're not synonymous. I am a Western scientist who is also Indigenous, who practices anti-colonial science and Indigenous science while still being a Western scientist. So it's not, so yeah, this issue of like, okay, I'm not advocating we throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, screw all standardization, but let's look at the colonial work that standardization does. And is there forms of standardizing or harmonizing that are less or not colonial? Yeah, absolutely. We aim to practice them in our lab, right? So yeah, trying to maneuver that is the problem, or that is the thing to do, maneuver, because it's, in our lab, we talk about maneuvering compromise. So we're Western scientists and we're not going to leave Western science because we love it here, even though it's also shitty in certain ways. So how do we maneuver this in a good way, given the terrain, right? And that's the thing. And that includes standardization, among other things, enumeration, all the things. Rachel, and then Fletcher.
One of the things I'm definitely still sitting with is the concept of land relations, and what a lot of you brought up about how we interact with our environment is something that I feel like as someone who's not a scientist and someone who's grown up in New York City, I feel very disconnected from, and something that I don't really consider on a daily basis. And I want to bring that in as something that I'm much more conscious of, because it's, I mean, fascinating. Yeah.
One of the things I say about prayer, so the way that my elder talks about, one of my elders talks about prayer is about the recognition of all your relations and like getting in sync with that. Very different than the Christian, like making a wish list and asking for certain things, mode of relation, or asking for certain types of gratitude. So I always say that the places that are the 2 easiest places in the world to pray are the deep bush and New York City. Because when you're walking, especially in Manhattan, I find, and I lived in New York City for 15 years in Bay Ridge, is you're walking along and you can feel the other people and you can feel the buildings and you can feel the history, and you start well, first of all, you start walking fast if you've, because you're not a tourist, right? And you start to groove, and you notice your relations, and you notice the environment, and it's as if there's a theme song playing, and you start, and that's prayer, and that's ceremony, right? And the same thing happens when you're in the deep bush or on a hike or something like that. So just because you're in lockdown in a concrete fortress does not mean you're not in the middle of land relations and that you can't tune into those things. Karen Ricolette has a piece on, and Renee, this is going to be trickier to find because I think it's a book chapter. Karen Ricolette has a piece on parking lot land. And it's not called that, so Renee, I'm sure you can't find it. But basically about land relations and like plants she finds in a parking lot and being in relation with those in a good way. She's in Toronto. So thank you. Fletcher and then Renee.
Well, now the thing I'm sitting with is your comment on prayer, but I'll process that next. I was going to say, I think something I'm still sitting with is the same thing I've been sitting with, because it's constantly been a feature of discussions among my colleagues as part of our ongoing anti-racist dialogue, is the tension between whether we as teachers have a duty to provide our students access to the culture of power, as some people have termed it, versus perpetuating that culture of power, which I think maps onto what we've been talking about today in the same way that it maps onto anti-racist discourse. So I don't know, I've been sitting with that for a while, but this is another thing to sit with.
It is. That's a very tricky subtlety. And as an Indigenous academic, where academia is like one of the sweetest gigs in the world, I am into accessing power, and I am into taking all the resources and returning them to land. I understand my primary role as a professional academic to be one of grifting, passing, to access, to give it back. Right? And I couldn't do that if I wasn't trained in the discourses and manners of power. If I didn't pass as an academic, as a civilized person, as a white person, I would not be nearly as successful I would be at returning literally millions of dollars of grant money to the land. So yeah, it's something I think about a lot. Yeah. There is, and I don't know how useful this would be, but the first chapter of Indigenous Statistics by Chris Anderson and Maggie Walter is about like, what do you do as an Indigenous statistician when you've got census data, which is super colonial and kind of racist, and that's what you have to work with, right? So how do, when the categories of health and success and stuff are super cultural to one very specific idea of what success is, higher, like more education, more money, not better relations, not better land, not, or like land, like ecology or whatever you want to call it. What do you do with that hot mess, and do good anti-colonial and Indigenous work with that? Anyway, it's not exactly on par with your question, but it deals with some of the same compromises that I think you're talking about. Yeah, that's exactly right. Renee, that's the citation.
Great.
Renee and then Madeline.
Great. I'm sitting with so many things right now, and one of them is the desire to give every teacher I've ever met in my life the time to sit down and sort of think through how to separate these different categories that you're talking about, and especially at a moment when in our own country, because we are who we are, the question of race has been so profound, and how we further complicate that conversation of how to do anti-racist science with anti-colonial science. But I do have to say, and this hinges on what Fletcher said, I really find your comment about prayer to be very profound and extremely helpful. in thinking about exactly this. So prayer is the recognition of all your relations. That seems like a kind of a simple but very deep and very beautiful way to begin to address those questions with students.
I do, if that resonates, I do recommend parsing it into terms that are appropriate to your cultural milieu as opposed to using Indigenous ones. But I mean, we talk about this when I was talking to Nikita about how we rematriate our samples. There are Indigenous folks who do ceremony, and then there are white folks who think about whales and animals and food webs and how grateful they are to be in a beautiful place. And those are both the point. Right? But no one's like, but the white folks aren't like, we're doing ceremony. We're like, no, you're not. You don't get any of the tobacco. We got the tobacco. You do your thing, which is legit and the point and right and good and anti-colonial. And we're going to be over here doing Indigenous ceremony, right? So, and this is part of sort of watching the appropriation line, being like, okay, you can go for the same goods and the same goals and the same things can resonate, but they are not always the same. And the model for this is the two-row wampum, which is the treaty for just north of, well, it overlaps actually part of the northern part of New York. And it's a treaty that says, okay, two waterways that never leak into each other, but flow in the same direction, that is our treaty. That is how we will coexist, and that is a respectful form of coexistence. You don't have to mix the waters, and we aren't down with that. We're down with going in the same direction towards the same goals on our own paths without mixing. And that is a legitimate, very legitimate form of allyship, of treaty, of relation, of all sorts of things. Yeah. Madeline and then Vanessa.
So one thing I've been sitting with, and thank you, Dr. Liboiron, for your comments just now, because that idea of samples, and I have a large collection of shells and rocks and minerals and exoskeletons that I've found because I wanted to give my students, in what is in my mind a tactile sensory experience of our natural world. But in reality, what I have done is taken without permission in most cases from land that did not belong to me and doesn't belong to my ancestors. And though, you know, trying to come to terms with like what I see as like my intent, right, versus my impact, and how ways in which I can recognize that and give some of these back to the land in ways that make sense for me. And I don't recognize that they were for my students, that these were things that were taken.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa and then Katrina.
I'm still struggling with the standardization thoughts in my head. And Madeline, thank you for that thought about the tactile nature of science. Yeah, with little kids, I just think of the vast amount of things they've brought me as presents from their trips, and things that I've thought to bring in, you know, from my own garden, you know, to share with them, because it's so necessary now. I think it's going to be very important to like just rethink that, and just be very careful and attribute to where you got these things, if because it's very necessary. So those are the things that you're dealing with young learners. I think that's what I most think about.
Yeah, so attribution is the first step, and then the next question is, how do we change the land relations of this? Doesn't mean you don't get to have tactile experience. It means you have to change the land relations of those tactile experiences. And there's a whole like spectrum of different ways to do that. So there's stuff called Zapatista science, there's queer science, there's feminist science, there's anti-colonial, there's a huge list, and they're all about changing dominant power dynamics that are part of dominant science, and they all do it different ways. So sometimes feminist science is kind of colonial, but sometimes it's not, right? So there's a huge spectrum of folks who have thought about this, and feminist science studies like was born in the 70s, and it's a field. People who've been thinking about this for a long time. So you're in good company, starting with these questions and being like, okay. Yeah, what do we do? Katrina and then Tracy.
I have like two things I'm thinking about, and Renee kind of like hit the nail on the head for me in thinking about how to go about with my older students, like in the 8th grade, that we do a lot of this work in trying to dismantle what's happening and why, and the government's effects, and how science and the government can be at odds. And how I'm wondering like how to frame a conversation for them. Like our school is very big into anti-racist work. We're a social studies school. We teach a curriculum on ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. We do a whole trimester of the Lenape for 3rd graders. But we don't do any anti-colonial work at all. Like it's never been mentioned in the school. So that's like the second part, I guess. Like how to, I guess, push maybe administration that this is another component. It's different there. And I don't know if I'm speaking incorrectly. There are areas where there's overlap, but it's still not the same thing. I don't even know if that's correct. I'm guessing. I'm thinking of a Venn diagram in my head. Anyway, those are my 2 thoughts.
Yeah, one of the things I'll add on the resource list is a consultant, an education consultant group based in New York that's Black and Indigenous folks. I think they're called Black and Red or something, but I totally have to check it out. Who deal with this, especially on the U.S. wave of like anti-racism, being like, and also Indigenous, which is different, but related in various ways. Yeah, so America, Kim Tallbear calls the United States the United States of erasure, where like, you've got the various sort of diversity spectrum, but for some reason Indigenous folks get left out. And the example of this recently was during the early days of the election counting, the earliest days where it had like white, black, something and something else. And maybe you saw the zillions of memes of Indigenous people being like, we're something else. But it's sort of, it's pretty consistent in the United States, more even than other colonial states like Canada or New Zealand or Australia and stuff. So yeah, I'm not surprised. Tracy and then Annie.
Oh, I was going to pass and say that I just want everything to sit, but I think I have to come clean. I kept thinking like, oh, how will I move from lip service to actually being anti-colonial? And I'm realizing that even my behavior as a scientist and what I model for my students is colonial. Like, it's not even that I'm, trying to do inclusion or just moving up this ladder. I'm literally treating materials in a really disrespectful way, and that really needs to change. And I'm happy that I got to sit here today and am rethinking this so intensely. So thank you.
So just remember, you are not to be blamed for or feel guilty about anything that happened before this workshop. You can't see the ground you stand on without someone else. It's literally under your feet. And as soon as you lift up a foot, you're on the other foot. You cannot question your premises by yourself. It is impossible. My job here is to pick you up and see, that's what you were standing on, right? So if that hasn't happened before, release all that to Jesus or whoever carries your guilt for you. And yeah, tomorrow's the day. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I don't recommend doing the subtle violence against yourself about like, damn it, I'm Western. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And that's okay, because that's your world and your culture. And remember, Western and colonial are not synonymous. So I sometimes get these folks that are like, I'm not doing my Indigenous ethics permits because paperwork is colonial. I'm like, no, paperwork is Western. Treaties are paperwork. Also, treaties are quite colonial, but not doing paperwork so you don't ask for permission to do your research is colonial, regardless of whether you're using paper or so starting to suss some of those things out becomes important too. Yeah. And also, like, Western culture actually has a whole lot of good land relations. actually. And so trying to identify those and where they align with anti-colonialism within Western cultures and within various, different types of Western cultures. Right, so like observation, just sitting with land and watching it and getting to know it. And that's Western, also happens to be Indigenous, also happens to be Buddhist, also happens to, right? There's a lot of good in that. So yeah, give yourself a little bit of break. Annie, but not all the break. Annie and then Nicholas, if Nicholas comes back in time.
So I've just still been thinking about the example that I shared about collecting invertebrates from in Cortlandt Park, and that's part of a larger initiative called the Urban Barcode Project, which exists throughout New York City. And so then thinking about so anyways, lots of thoughts about that and how I might change that.
We have a rule in our lab that we kill for food and scavenge for science. There's wild and country food is a huge part of this province, partially because it's such a poor province, and that's never moved out of various cultural traditions, both settler and Indigenous. And so we, part of the way I understand that is a lot of Indigenous folks, including Métis, have what are called original instructions, which means in a lot of creation stories, humans were latecomers to the world, like super latecomers, and like muskrats were like way first, and like humans are like way late. They show up to the party and everyone's like, who are you? And humans were like, I'm cold, help me, or various versions of that, or like, I've fallen down, help me, something like that. And one of the agreements that people and various animals came to is like, we'll help feed you if you show gratitude and also help us with this, that, and the other thing. And those are called the original instructions. And Métis folks, and this isn't universal across Indigenous groups, but Métis folks, for a lot of different fish and stuff like that, our original instructions are you can kill them if you eat them, but there are no original instructions about you can kill them to preserve them in ethanol. Right? So why don't our lab doesn't do that? But we do follow the because I'm also the lab lead, right? And so it's my job to make sure that people under my jurisdiction also follow the original instructions, regardless of whether they're Métis or Indigenous. Yeah, so that's sort of because we deal in animal body parts, but there are various anti-colonial ways to deal in that. It's not a vegan feminist anti-kill situation, especially not when you're Indigenous, but there are ways to kill well. Getting folks for samples is not one of them. So, there's a milieu there. Just wanted to point that out. Nicholas, you're next. Are you ready? You disappeared. And then Felicia.
Sorry, I had to go to the bathroom.
Legit, that's legit.
Yeah, so I think for me, what I'm just thinking about is how to internalize everything, put it into action, and then not forget about it later. And I think that goes across the board with a lot of the different kinds of like diversity related topics, is how to maintain the stance. Right?
So clear is we call ourselves an anti-colonial lab, sometimes the feminist lab. And I had a student once being like, why aren't we called an anti-racist lab? And, and I was like, well, we can't be an anti-colonial, feminist, anti-racist, pro-immigration, anti-ableism lab, because those are different things and you cannot prioritize everything or you are not prioritizing. Of course, we are also accountable and beholden to those things in various ways, but it's sort of like the difference between your daughter and your cousin 3 times removed. Yes, you're accountable to them both, but one of them you are accountable to more. And so what we do as a lab at this point every 3 years is we re-articulate our values as a collective. We do consensus-based decision-making and facilitation. We say, okay, what are our main 2 or 3 values? And when there's this milieu of like too many things to do and too many things to focus on, what is our greatest good? And it turns out that by doing that greatest good, you also impact all of these peripheral goods. So what is good for your daughter is often also good for your 3rd cousin twice removed, or whatever it's called. So our primary values, and anti-colonial is short for this, is humility, accountability, and good land relations. And if you do things with humility, which means you recognize that you are always connected to others and you are not superior, not your way of knowing, not your way of doing, not your experience, then a lot of that other stuff, like that is one way to sort of go through anti-racism, because it's really hard to be racist if you're also humble. Also anti-colonialism, also, right? So that's not an answer, but it is an approach to be like, okay, what are you beholden to the most that helps you maneuver when there are too many goods or too many bads, or like no goods and just a variety of bads and less bads? How do you maneuver that? Yeah. Renee, I want to check in. We've got about 8 minutes left. Is that true?
Oh, we're well out of time, but I don't think anybody
shit,
cares.
Sorry. I was looking at the wrong time. I hate, okay, we're done. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Apologies for keeping you over. I can't tell time. It's linear.
Wait,
it's horrible in Western. I'm just kidding.
It is. Agreed. Agreed. I'm feeling like we all, like, this shouldn't end, that this conversation is really a very powerful one. And I know what you've done so far, Max, is to take what is a profoundly important and complex topic, and you've given us a really doable avenue into it, which I think everybody here appreciates enormously. You've also given us so many good resources, some of which we've captured in the chat, which we'll distribute to the students. But for example, the Karen Ricolette article, you're right, I have no idea which one that is. And so any further resources that you can provide for us would be great. But I'm wondering if you want to send us off with any final words before we close today.
Nope, just thank you for showing up and staying and being so polite and not telling me I'd gone over time. Although in the future, please tell me that. And I'll send you a list of resources that we've talked about.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much, Max. And thank you to all of you who are here.